Hello everyone and welcome to yet another video from the Motion Debrief series from the AIS Interschool Debating Championship. My name is Gavin Senaratne. I am a debater for the engineering faculty debate team of the University of Mortua. And the motion that I will be covering is the semifinals motion from this competition, which was focused on philosophy. The motion reads, this house prefers a view of the state primarily as a necropolitical actor. There's an info slide for what a necropolitical act is. So necropolitics is a political philosophy which argues that the state primarily acts to determine who is and who is not deserving of life. The state's function historically has been to provide the conditions of life for some and allow others to simply die. So when we get about to looking at this motion, there are a few things that you need to sort out at the beginning from either side. So when you have a this house prefers, this house supports, this house regrets, or whatever motion, the motion says one thing, you support this thing or you prefer this thing, and as a team your first job is to figure out what the alternative is. So in this house prefers motions, like in comparison to what do you prefer a view of the state as a primarily necropolitical actor? And the way I would go about this is to very simply say that the alternative is status quo. So how are states viewed in status quo is the first question that you need to ask yourself. I would typically say that you would view the state in terms of like the social contract. So you give up certain rights and in exchange the state guarantees a certain set of rights. It's basically a trade that happens between you and the state. So you ensure that your right to own your property and so on and so forth is protected, but in exchange for that you give up certain rights. So you can no longer exercise your right to violence, you can no longer engage in hate speech, you cannot attempt to overthrow the state, and so on and so forth. So you give up certain privileges, and in exchange, the state protects certain rights that you have. What changes when you view the state as a necropolitical actor? So now, instead of viewing this as a transaction between you and the state, where you pay taxes and you give up certain rights in exchange for the state protecting certain rights, now you begin to view the state as sort of an arbiter of life and death that rules over you. So yes, there is still the concept of you giving up certain rights, but now instead of viewing the state as someone who grants rights in exchange for that, you view the state as this entity that um, has control over who lives and who dies. So that's what changes. The first question that you need to ask yourself is, does the state or the functioning of the state literally change? As in, does the state suddenly go out and start killing people and shooting you in the streets because the state doesn't think that you deserve to live? That's not necessarily the case. It is likely for us to believe that people will be rational and people will not accept that kind of treatment. And states won't develop in such a manner because it's simply unsustainable. Um, so states themselves will likely probably look the same. There is some argumentation to be made there, and I'll be getting to that into the separate analysis. But what you want to do at the beginning is to try avoiding, any sort of extreme characterizations, because that's going to put you at a disadvantage as the debate progresses. So first, let's look at the proposition case and then move on to the opposition case. On proposition, the idea is simple. So the sort of framing that you give out at the very beginning is to say that life is important and people take life very seriously. And that's how you set up the debate, because viewing the state as an necropolitical actor means you view sort of the policies of the state enacted by the state as a matter of life and death. And that's the premise of like every other argument that's going to exist in your case. So that's the first thing that you need to say. From that point onwards, your arguments focus on how this view of the state affects how people perceive the state and how people act in like their relationship with the state. So now that we have that premise, how do we go about building a case for proposition? The first kind of push that I want to make is to say that the kind of policies that we are going to have are going to change. I'll just go over the sort of premises that I want to cover, and then we'll get into the analysis behind it. So since you're going to view the state as a necropolitical actor, you are going to view the policies enacted by the state through the scope of life and death. And as a consequence of that, what I visualize happening is that you will have more policies that benefit vulnerable communities, because being in favor of life generally means that more people are going to have better quality of life. or more people are going to live at the end of the day. What exactly does this look like? So consider the example of economic policy. In abstract terms, you support things like inflation because it's good for the economy, it pushes growth, and so on and so forth. But inflation disproportionately hurts poor people and might necessarily end up in some of them starving and dying at the end of the day. And the reason for this is simple. If you are rich, you have assets, your wages go up with inflation, and therefore you're not hurt by it so much. If you're poor, you don't have assets, you work in a job that doesn't increase your wages that keep in a way that keeps up with inflation, and so therefore you are more likely to be disadvantaged by that. So now instead of viewing economic policy in terms of numbers, people are going to view economic policy as a matter of life and death, because the state is deciding that, look, X number of poor people need to die so that Y number of people in the middle and upper classes can have a better life. When you view the economic policy through this metric, it makes it seem more serious, and it drives people to be more in favor of welfare spending and similar economic policies. Also, since you're viewing it in terms of life and death, people are also going to take the policies more seriously. What that means is that if a state fails to fulfill certain promises, people are more likely to hold the state accountable for that and vote out the government that failed to uphold these promises. Ultimately, then, the argument that you're trying to make here is that you're going to help vulnerable communities because the people who are indirectly hurt by these policies are vulnerable communities at the end of the day. Another example perhaps could be environmental policy. So now, instead of viewing environmental policy through the lens of rising sea levels or rising global temperatures, you're looking at it through the lens of the number of people killed by wildfires or typhoons or so on and so forth. And ultimately, that means that people are going to take environmental policy more seriously and support policies that end up, saving more lives. So that's the first argument that you want to make, that there are concrete benefits that come about as a consequence of people viewing the state as a necropolitical actor because they support policies that are more, I would say pro-life, but that has a different connotation, that are more life-friendly. And therefore, as a consequence of that, people from vulnerable communities are more likely to survive or at the very least have a better quality of life. The second argument that I want to make using this premise is with regards to international relations. And the claim that I'm trying to make here is that states are more likely to work in terms of the global interest or in a more globalist perspective. And the reason for this is that people are going to be more supportive of supporting foreign nations. The idea behind this is simple. Again, you are reframing certain policies in terms of lives instead of numbers. So, for example, if you take something like foreign aid or refugees, right? Instead of viewing it as, we gave out this many dollars to a certain nation, you are now going to look at it as, look, this particular first world nation decided that you would kill 50 million babies or something like that, right? You would also, like, instead of framing it as 2.6 million refugees entered our country, you would say that you allow 2.6 million people to die in a war zone. So it's that kind of reframing that makes people take these policies more seriously. But also, the second thing is, it makes it much harder for people to reject those policies because they look at it from like a sort of position of privilege and they feel like they're taking away the lives of other individuals. And so, therefore, the way I visualize this is that there is going to be a greater degree of support and a lesser degree of opposition in first world countries to provide aid and refuge for individuals from poorer nations. So those are like the two pushes that I have. And again, there are other themes that you can explore or other aspects of governance that you can explore to try and figure out how the behavior of the state might change when you view it as a necropolitical actor. Keeping that in mind, let's move on to the opposition case. Now, one potential line that you can run as opposition is to say, look, necropolitics is going to get normalized with time, and therefore we are going to ultimately reach a situation where viewing the state as a necropolitical actor is going to create a world that is no different from the world we live in right now. This might be viable, but it's not strategically a good idea. And the reason for that is simple. Because if you say that, necropolitics is going to become normalized and we are eventually going to converge to a world that is the same as it is right now, you don't have a case on opposition. And that just generally makes for a very boring and symmetric debate. And it's not really the best way to try and win a debate. So, what's the other way of going about it? You accept the premise that people view the state differently and people view state policies differently. And you try to show the harms of that. The first way that I would go about this is to say that viewing the state as a necropolitical actor inherently gives the state permission to act in a directly necropolitical fashion. Now, what do I mean by this? If we view all policies, such as economic policy and so on and so forth, as necropolitical, what that means is you would also think more direct policies that directly deal with taking away lives of individuals are also completely justified and also completely within the scope of the state. So, for example, you would just straight up refuse disaster relief to a certain area because you think that those resources could be better used to save lives elsewhere. You would, for example, not provide any kind of subsidies to rural areas because you think that those subsidies could save more lives when focused on an urban area. Again, it's not enough to just say that because intuitively these sound like bad things, but you need to prove that they are bad things because ultimately, if the other side says, ah, no, but we are saving more lives, then that doesn't help you in that clash. So, how do you go about weighing this in your favor? I think the simplest argument here is to say that some things can only be done by the state. So if you're providing disaster relief, that's not something an NGO can do. If you're, as in like going to a proper disaster area, if you're providing subsidies to extremely rural areas, again, that's not something that the average person can do. There are some things that only the state can do, and it's important that people pressure the state to do those things. If you view the state as a necropolitical actor, if they can just play the concept of lives as a simple numbers game, and if in fact their decision is still completely rational, it might be undesirable in this scenario simply because of the necessity of the state to be involved in this kind of instances. The concept of alternatives is going to enter sort of second argument as well. So I have like three ideas under this, and I'll go through them one by one. And the premise of this argument is simple. If you begin to view everything, and it builds on the premise that's brought to you by proposition. So proposition says if you view things in terms of life and death, you're going to take these things more seriously. You say yes, but what that also means is that things that don't necessarily mean life or death are going to be taken less seriously. Now, what exactly do I mean by this? The first claim that I'd like to make is that you would sort of lose the value that you hold for democratic rights. So, for example, things like freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. Because these don't necessarily correlate with the loss or gain of life, right? And in a world where you view the state as a necropolitical actor, and if we are to believe that people will take life very seriously, and people will take policies associated with life very seriously, what that means is that the policies not associated with life are going to be taken less seriously. Now, why exactly is this important? Well, you could argue that certain democratic rights or certain freedoms that you have are what make your life worth living. And in the absence of these lives, you might as well be dead. And that's sort of the weighing that you need to bring out in this kind of argumentation to show that it's important. The other aspect that you could talk about is probably in terms of arts and culture. Again, these aren't things that necessarily relate to the loss of life. However, you still think that they're certainly important. So, for example, you would say in Sri Lanka, Sigiri is a cultural heritage, but the state might want to break down Sigiri into tiny rocks and then use those rocks in a construction project to build an apartment complex that can house a lot of people. And in terms of life and death, that might be a good thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing in terms of like the preservation of culture, which is still important to people. And again, it's a question of being something that only the state can do. Because typically, people who are passionate about the preservation of arts and culture are not people with a large amount of funding behind them. And therefore, it's very hard for you to expect like private individuals to do that kind of thing, which is why the state needs to be involved in such projects or in such instances. On the other hand, if you think about something like welfare for the poor, or if you think about something like hospitals or homelessness, these are things that society in general is largely passionate about and that can be achieved through like crowdfunding or charity efforts. And so therefore you don't necessarily need the state to be involved in these things, even though they are matters of life and death. So the question of like what can only be done by the state, this question of exclusivity, is going to be a way in which you weigh this argument against the arguments brought by proposition. I think the final thing then I want to cover is with regards to the previous idea on foreign relations and sort of global interactions. Because true enough, you might end up supporting things like humanitarian aid or supporting things like providing refuge to individuals. But at the same time, you might end up deprioritizing things that are not directly correlated to life. So, for example, the expansion of education programs abroad, the expansion of like journalism or things like that in authoritarian regimes, you probably won't support this kind of thing because it's not necessarily correlated to life and death. But while you might be preserving more life, there will be no increase in quality of life because you don't support the policies that lead to an increased quality of life. So again, like under those three things, the main thing that we're trying to prove here is that policies that are not necropolitical are likely to be taken less seriously and deprioritized at the end of the day because of the high focus that you're going to put on policies that are necropolitical and political and policies that do have an impact on life and death. The cool thing about this argument is that the stronger the proposition argument becomes, as in the more seriously you take economic policy, homelessness, the environment, and so on and so forth, the less seriously you will take all of these things, such as the preservation of arts and culture, the preservation of democratic rights, and you know, giving development aid or like educational aid to foreign nations. So it's an argument that grows strong as the other side's arguments grow stronger, and then you can weigh them up against each other and like have a nice clash there. So that's pretty much all I have for proposition and opposition. As always, if you all have any questions, you can leave them in the comments, and I hope all of you all learned something from this video.